Good morning. My name is Carla Schad, and on behalf of Global Genes and the Orphan Disease Center, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to the session on critical considerations in collaborating with patients and patient advocacy groups. Thank you so very much for taking time to join us. But before we get started, I wanted to review a few brief housekeeping notes. The chat box to the left of the video allows you to interact with each other and program staff, and we hope that you use this opportunity to make new connections. Please note that links and resources are not able to be shared via the chat. If you would like to upload any shared resources for the community, please share those on the social wall. The question box is also located at the left of your screen. We encourage you to use questions box to share your questions with the presenters. This is your time to find answers and insights to help you advance your work as a partner in research. Please note that the speakers will not be able to see any of the questions entered to the chat area rather than the official questions section. If we are not able to address all of your questions, we'll do our absolute best to follow it after. To the right of the video, you will see captions and translations. To utilize either, please expand the session and select your language. Thank you to Horizon and Greenwich Biosciences for their support of these tools. If you have any questions about the technology or the program, please look for the Request Support button in each session on the live support chat in the bottom corner of all non-session pages. Finally, we encourage you all to participate as active listeners and take advantage of an opportunity to hear from leaders and experts here and ask questions of them. We want to ensure that we have created a relevant and impactful program for you, and we greatly appreciate sharing your time with us here today. So as we start, I would like to introduce the first presenter, and it's my distinct pleasure. It is Laurie Bailey. She is an associate director at Zogenix, the same company that I also work as a senior director in medical affairs. Laurie and I have had the great pleasure to work together for the last 5 years as an industry sponsor of an advocacy project related to sibling voices. Laurie, with that, I'm going to turn this over to you, and also to note that the next speaker following Laurie, Lauren, there are three things, or something that we all three have in common, and it's interesting. Me knowing Laurie for a very long time and then meeting Lauren for the first time last week, there's one common denominator that you will find amongst these presenters as well as myself. And we have the mentality, no matter what we do, if you keep the patient first, we will never go wrong. And I hope that you will feel and see this mantra through their presentations and their engagement today. So Laurie, over to you.
Thank you, Carla, and good morning to everyone. I'm so happy that you took time to join us today. A little bit about myself. I work on the medical advocacy within Zogenix, and I want to share with you an example of how we have collaborated. As Carla had mentioned, we've worked together for many years, and we've had the very great honor and privilege to work with many of the DEE groups, rare epilepsies. And, you know, through our engagement with the different groups, we have really, we think, learned how to collaborate with them in a meaningful way. And I wanted just to kind of share with you a little bit today on kind of how we have done this. So, you know, one of the most important things that we've learned is really to listen. You know, a lot of us have a lot of experience in industry. We have, you know, many, many years of engaging with different stakeholders. And, you know, with rare disease, really listening to the communities, to the organizations that support the communities is so key. And when I say listen, I mean listening with like no preconceived notions of what you think you might learn. And that kind of brings me to the next point of kind of doing it without an agenda. we've learned from the community by showing up at their events, by listening, and by really trying to understand and not having a specific goal in mind when we show up other than just to learn. And so I know it sounds like a no-brainer, but it's actually hard to do when you have a different lens, when you have a different perspective. And it does take some effort to really listen with an open mind and be open to what you might learn. The other thing that I think is really, really important in collaborating with patient groups is collaborating from the start. You know, what'll happen a lot of times is we'll hear stories and you will observe behaviors, or we'll think we are identifying, you know, what seems like it might be an unmet need. But until we actually go to the community and share with them what our learnings are, we don't really know for sure. So what we always want to do is listen and then take our learnings back to the community. And before we even start a project that we think might benefit the community, we need to vet it with them and discuss it with them and find out if this is something that's actually going to be meaningful to them. You know, what we hear a lot from patient communities is nothing for us without us. And it's just so true, because only they can tell you what they need and what's going to be meaningful. And so if you really start that collaboration with them right from the very start, right when that first initial idea pops into your head, sorry, I've got a little pop-up on my screen. Apologies for that. But if you start it right from the very beginning, you're going to have so much more success, and it's going to be so much more meaningful. And then it's also, you know, really important to us to think about the outcomes. You know, once you do start brainstorming on ideas and you determine that there's something that you want to work on together, making sure that there is a mutually beneficial outcome is going to be really critical, especially if you're doing any kind of research or you're asking the community to invest their time in a project, because their time is so valuable, and especially with rare disease families, their time is extremely, extremely valuable. And you always want to make sure that when you're collaborating with them and you're working on something, that there's going to be something for the community in the end. And, you know, it might be sharing of data, it might be sharing your learnings, it might be creating resources. There are many different types of outcomes that can happen that could be meaningful. So you guys need to work together and really decide on what that is. And it's going to be different for every group and for every project. So that's just kind of a general approach that we've had to working with the community as it relates to collaboration on things. And I'd like to share with you, you know, just a quick example of a project that we've been working on. So Carla mentioned that we've been working on a project that is related to siblings. And so as a result of working with the communities and kind of really listening to them, we identified an unmet need that was related to siblings and the impact that a DEE, or developmental epileptic encephalopathy, has on families, and in particularly the siblings. I mean, if you think about it, with really probably many rare diseases, the parents are not the only caregivers in the family. The siblings are also caregivers, and they are impacted in very similar ways that parents are. And so what we found is that there really wasn't an awareness within that community, within, you know, on the impact of siblings. And so we set out with hand in hand with the organizations and with the community to find out, first of all, what it was that we didn't know, because we really didn't know anything. There wasn't a lot of data out there. And in particular, we weren't able to find any reports where the siblings themselves gave their perspective. So we worked with the communities and developed a research survey project with several different DEE groups. And then after the research was completed, we did want to share that data back out into the community. But rather than just reporting it out into the community, we went down the path of putting it out there through abstracts and posters and ultimately to a full manuscript. Because what we thought was really important was not just to be able to raise awareness within the community itself, but to really raise awareness within the clinician community. And then by sharing the data out in that way, we were able to help raise awareness and maybe start moving the needle to help these families and the siblings. And then once we determined that, and actually this next piece actually came from the Dravet syndrome community, what is next? I mean, it was great to identify the unmet needs. It was great to identify that these kids needed help and support. But now that we know this, what are we going to do about it? So, I have to be honest, initially when we presented this data back out, it was with a little bit of hesitation because some of the findings that we learned, were a little bit difficult because one of the most important findings was that the parental perception of the impact was lower than what siblings were actually reporting. And so when we first put the data out there, I mean, it was great, but it was like, well, this is great. Now you've presented us with this problem and, now what can we do? And so that's when we took the next step to work with the Dravet community and collaborated not only with the community and with the organization, but also with other healthcare professionals who were experts in the field, with psychologists, to make sure that we were putting together resources that were going to be specific to their needs and that would be meaningful. And so we worked on that last year, and we kicked off that project and launched resources for these communities. And so that's just, this is an example of how we have approached some of this collaboration. Of course, my company, they develop treatments for rare diseases. But what we've learned in working with these rare disease groups is that it's not just about the treatments, and the treatments are extremely important. And we do work on that aspect as well with patient advocacy and engagement. We support all of our company cross-functional departments, such as clinical and other areas, in making sure that the patient voice is integrated every step of the way. For me, one of my focuses is, as I mentioned, to look at other areas outside treatment and look at the burden of disease. And so this is how we try to look at things holistically. And, as Carla mentioned in the beginning, putting that patient first, also putting their families first. And we can't solve every problem, but hopefully, occasionally, if we're really listening to the community, we will find ways that we can go beyond the treatments and support the whole family. I mean, we do have as well, other areas that we do that with scientific publications and other kinds of research on the burden of the disease to try to help in many aspects. And then just the last point I want to make before I turn it back over to Carla is that it takes a village. I mean, we are, one small company. We have a small department of people, who work on these things, a small team. We can't do it by ourselves, and we shouldn't do it by ourselves. I mean, we have to work with the community. We have to work with patients, like they say, nothing for us without us. And not just the patients, but other healthcare professionals and other people that are out in these disease areas. It really does take a village of all of us working together to support these amazing families. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Carla, and just thank you very much. I look forward to all your questions and continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Miss Laurie. And I must say that for the young researchers that are on this Zoom call today, is that it's from the point of view of research, is that there's really no question that's too small whenever we're working in the advocacy community. And it was 5 years ago when I turned to Laurie and sort of talked about my clinical experiences and the kids coming to the clinic with their families in tow. It was, some people might think that this is not exactly the most amazing science, but it is, because we kept the patient first and the family first. And the data that came out of this was totally innovative. And quite frankly, Laurie, I think that by us listening and our collaboration with the advocacy group, being total advocates and letting them drive us, we created wonderful data, findings, and then ultimate resources, all because it was simple and we listened. And so with that, as I mentioned, I met Miss Lauren last week, and Lauren Lee is the executive vice president at NEFCURE, which deals with the very, very rare conditions with glomerular disease in the kidney. And it was fascinating to me that whenever we had our discussions, that I'm on the industry side, Miss Laurie's on the industry side, she's in the advocacy group side. But the thing that aligns us where we mesh is our dedication to keeping the patient first. So with that, I will turn it over to Miss Lauren for her presentation.
Thank you so much, Carla, and thank you everyone for being here. I love serving on a panel just to see the different perspectives coming from industry partnering with advocacy groups. And then of course, I'm sort of representing a patient community through an advocacy group. As Carla suggested, I have been at NEFCURE for 9 years. I'm the Executive Vice President of Stakeholder Engagement. And that really is a fancy way or fancy title that demonstrates that my job is really to keep the collective community of researchers, patient families, clinicians, regulators, advocates on the same page around expediting treatments to patients living with some of the rare kidney conditions that we serve. I hope today to go through my presentation and talk a little bit about the gold standards from my perspective of working with multiple sponsors regularly in this space. 9 years ago when I started with NEFCURE, there was one company considering going into looking at these rare kidney spaces, and today we're looking at 18 plus clinical trials, which has been really an explosion and represents hope for our community. But it also gives me, the patient community, the sponsors in this space, an opportunity to really collaborate and work together. So with that, so I think it is really different working with rare disease communities. And I'm not going to read this slide, but I'd like to go through a couple of highlights. Patients living with rare diseases often face a long journey before they receive an accurate diagnosis. So there's incredible frustration and years of unanswered questions or clarity around their disease. It's important to know that not just from the physical side of things, but the emotional and psychological side. Their symptoms are often overlooked. Some of these are really invisible illnesses where patients don't look sick. So it's hard for them to relate to family and friends who don't understand their disease. As you can imagine, having a rare disease puts people in the position of feeling really alone in their diagnosis, and often never connect with others who are experiencing similar feelings of isolation. There are often, as we know, great unmet need in the rare space where there are no approved treatment options. If you've seen one patient, you've seen one patient. If you look at a rare disease community, it's so important for researchers and industry to connect with the community more intimately, because many of them really experience individual journeys within that spectrum of rare disease. Lacking appropriate support systems, we know that, as I was saying to Carla and Laurie before, that I thank goodness and I thank God every day for the internet, because I think that a lot of these rare patients have been able to connect and find critical support systems through online social media groups and connect with others like them. So this is just a couple of examples, anecdotal evidence that I wanted to share with all of you that really brings to life and illustrates some of the points I made before, not only about the physical toll or frustration around the symptoms and side effects of offline medications or off-label medications, but also about the emotional and mental frustration. So, you know, my son told me today that he's feeling really alone and isolated. We know that children especially really suffer because they're going to school with kids who are living more normal lifestyles. This disease and how it impacts, as Laurie and Carla's sibling program suggests, it impacts their relationships. Siblings are affected, marriages are affected. On the research side, I think that often rare patients are so caught up in seeing specialists, dealing with kind of the uncertainty of what's coming next, that there's really a strong reliance on their physician or their specialist to guide them on their journey. So I want to bring up with all of you that, you know, if a clinical trial is right for me, there's an assumption on the patient side that their doctor is going to mention it to them. And instead, I think that's where advocacy groups come in to really educate and empower patients to know, talk to your doctor, ask your doctor. We've got 18 clinical trials in the pipeline right now. Consider talking to your doctor about this. This idea of data release, I love that you mentioned that, Laurie, in your illustration. People sign up for studies, observational studies, complete surveys, participate in clinical trials, and never know what happened at the end of it. So I want to just mention here, part of forming relationships with patients is giving back to them and making sure that you are seeing them through sort of their journey from beginning to end. And last but not least, I want to talk to if there are any providers in the room or advocates in the room working with clinicians. We hear regularly that doctors are so focused on the well-being and the medical disease-related health and outcomes of patients. They often don't hear that side effects of medications are really bad, affecting quality of life, that actually, I think, ultimately impact those outcomes, because patients not feeling well and frustrated by, you know, even just a tinkering with dose or talking about a different combination of things or just switching up kind of a medication regimen can make all the difference. And I think it's really important for advocacy groups to remind patients of having those conversations so that they feel heard. Some guiding principles for those of you out there looking to engage with patients, starting at the beginning and starting as you mean to go on, I think is really critical. Tap into your advocacy groups that exist, even if they are volunteer-based. There are a lot of, again, mom and pop, really ultra rare diseases that have 10 families championing their journey. And then there's some more evolved organizations like NEFCure who have more of an infrastructure, but all are interested in learning and working with industry and investigators and researchers out there, because anybody looking at these rare diseases means something to them and represents hope. Consider bringing them early and often, again, not just at the beginning, but maintaining those relationships, because I think this goes a long way in building trust. And how you start, I like to always say this to people, let them share their stories, listen to them. Again, no agenda. That's how you really, I don't want to say win them over, but start to develop a really kind of back and forth relationship, is giving them the voice at the outset and not launching right into, what do you think of this protocol? Avoiding assumption. I think that, again, we're in lockstep with Laurie's presentation around your end goal might not align with the patient's priorities. And I go back to a story of a patient who once said to me that she went to her doctor and was put on a 6-month new regimen for her kidney disease, but it was causing her teeth to actually deteriorate and decay. And she was a white collar professional who often had to attend meetings and present publicly. And she went to her doctor and said, this new medication is not working for me. And he said, but your kidneys look great. And she said, but I can't live like this. So again, just remembering the whole picture when you're treating patients. For many, I think it's really important to remind people that the average patient distracted by their rare disease thinks of research as microscopes and men in labs in white coats. It's really important, I think, that we shift over to research participation, the fact that clinical trial 101 education, bringing sort of research to life in a patient involvement sort of way, an interactive experience for them, but also this idea of it represents hope. People looking at these diseases, studying these diseases, and supporting this patient community is really important to remind patient communities. I always like to tell people too that don't make the assumption that people are out there seeking clinical trials. Nobody aspires to grow up and be in a clinical trial. It's not a position anyone wants to be in, but you can change the way you frame it. And again, offer that hope to them when discussing it. And last but not least, that mutual beneficial partnership, I think, is really important. Setting up studies, observational studies, and the amount of questions you're asking them and the time they have to put in, or the number of study visits in an interventional trial. Really think about engaging patients to make it a patient-friendly protocol. And also, last but not least, I think that patients who are involved in any sort of research activity, and we've seen this very much, whether it be, again, participating in a survey, participating in a voice of patient focus group, or an interventional study, really a deep involvement, become more educated and activated patients. And don't forget that they're the ones out there connected to others in their community, talking about their experiences. And last but not least, just thinking about some practical tips and considerations and gold standards for engaging with patients in research projects. I think that, again, I mentioned partnering with advocacy groups as a place to start. But really, the voice of patient and the patient storytelling at the beginning is really important, and also capturing a diverse array of experiences, different geographies. Somebody living in a city could likely be connected to a more savvy academic center that's running clinical trials. With somebody more isolated is really removed from that, seen by a community specialist. Consider ethnicity, consider social demographics. Also, getting to know each other, as I said, the patient storytelling up front. I think it's really important also to let them know about time commitments, let them know how often, how long your company, we're starting out now in this space and just getting started, or a researcher working at an institution. I have a 2-year project. I'd like you to be involved for 2 years. Being really kind of transparent up front. And then again, I think you can maximize the success of any sort of research project by making sure that your goals, your study protocol, everything is sort of in alignment with patients and their own time commitment, their own interests, and making sure that you can be successful just by involving them up front. And with that, I will turn it back over to Carla. I'm interested in your questions and look forward to some nice conversation.
Ms. Lauren, thank you. And you brought up a very good point in your conversation. It's interesting with the rare epilepsy groups, advocacy groups that we work with. It's very fascinating to me is that how much of an advocate the parents are for their children. And in all reality, these are the people that are coming to the clinics and sometimes are more knowledgeable about newer treatments than some of the clinicians. And it's their voice that is, heard more and more loudly compared to years in the past. And I make comparison as to whenever I went to medical school and when I started my training, paternalism was on its way out in medicine, where you had the sense that, the doctor's always right. I'll do whatever they say. And, they're the doctor. But now, we've got people and the families, the caregivers, the advocates are, they're becoming so educated, and it is okay to challenge. And medicine now has become more and more of a partnership. And from my perspective, as Laurie and I work with the communities and these advocacy groups, the same mentality is there, that paternalism does not live in advocacy. And our research collaborations, in no way, shape, form, or fashion can you come into an advocacy group and tell them what they need, because they know what they need. And it all comes back to that overall partnership and working together and meshing together. So Ms. Lauren and Ms. Laurie, as we go into the question and answers from the audience, I did want to sort of kick it off with a question. And the question that I have for both of you is, what does it mean to really step back and take that holistic approach, and when collaborating and engaging with patients, as well as the patient advocates in your both's opinion?
Okay, I guess I'll start. Great question. I think that it's really important to start with a lot of listening, as I think you all did, and looking at ways to consider beyond the medical treatments or the therapeutics or the disease-specific unmet needs, looking at the psychosocial unmet needs that really impact the families, not just the patient, the families who are burdened by rare disease every day. And that can be financial constraints. That can be the fact that the family's breaking down because there's one sick child and 3 other siblings who don't have as much of a spotlight on them and have their own challenges. I think that we experience, there are educational challenges for our rare disease patient community that put them in the position of needing 504 plans or 501 plans where the schools can support them in different ways. But how can industry work together with advocacy groups to help fill those gaps, provide those resources so that families feel armed and resourced to holistically handle and deal, I think, with their disease?
Ms. Laurie, what are your thoughts with that question?
Yeah, no, I agree. Those are all excellent points, Lauren. And then in addition, I would say that, one of the things that we need to do is to be transparent. And we can't go into this holistic approach without trust and without being genuine. People can see right through you. And you must be really genuine. You must be putting the patient first. You must have that compassion and really do that. And when I say be transparent, from the industry perspective, we want to be transparent. We can't be transparent about everything. Because there are some things, and obviously we're heavily regulated. We have a lot of compliance guidelines that we have to follow with federal, with state. And then in addition, we have to really be aware of each patient group and their own guidelines and policies that we want to be aware of. And so it's being upfront, being transparent, and being transparent about what you can't be transparent about. And if you can't do things, there are certain things that we can't make promises about, right? There are certain things that we can't do. And so just being upfront about that and just being honest, and that is the best way, I think, to really holistically approach things, because you've got to have that transparency, that trust in everything that you do.
I want to add to that, because one of the things that we try to do as an organization is, and I think I referenced this a little bit in my talk, but the idea of companies being interested in this space and investing really should represent hope to the communities at large. We hope that people feel that there's been progress. There's a better understanding of these diseases to even get to where they are. And so we have taken the approach that every webinar, every website update, every social media message, we try very hard to incorporate an empowerment message around having the conversation with their doctor, seeking a second opinion, asking questions, so that the community, I think, feels a confidence and a security around engaging with industry, around understanding industry. We weave clinical trial talks. We try to put you all in the same room together as much as possible so that industry is listening and learning from patients. But at the same time, we try to allow sponsors to share 2-minute commercials about their company with the culture of their company, which I think patients then really start to understand more and also feel that trust, truly feel trust.
And from my perspective, I know, having worked with Laurie, it is such a comfort whenever you look at these organizations and the families, when they do trust you. And I have to say, between Laurie and I, with the organizations we work with, it's because we have that empathy and we have that devotion, and, you know, always keeping that alignment of, you know, keeping them first, and essentially don't tell them what to do, but to listen. There's immense trust. And I think one of the things that Laurie and I do so well together is to make sure that in no way, shape, form, or fashion do we break that trust. And, you know, there may be other partners here and there, but it's all about that trust and, you know, our dedication to them with no hidden agendas, that we're all about them. So with that, I've got the first question that comes in via Brian, and he asks, would you say it's highly valuable to have a patients or advocacy organization represented in the research protocol development? Every voice involved in the project will assure compliance and more successful outcomes. So what's your thoughts about, and Laurie, I know we've done this, but when Lauren in particular, whenever companies actually come to you, the organizations and the caregivers and patients, and asking your thoughts about clinical trials?
So I think it's a fantastic idea. I think it's important every step of the way. Our approach and our advice to the sponsors is to make this a process and not a one and done focus group for an hour, where they, the night before, send the protocol that may not be something digestible or understandable to the patients. So we often recommend a get to know you call. The advocacy group, we have identified clinical trial participants and non-clinical trial participants that understand how to talk with pharma. We call them our voice of patient volunteers. And some of them are highly literate because they've participated and some are not. And we put them in a room and suggest that there is a get to know you call, and then pharma talks just a little bit about what they've got in the pipeline and what sort of they're working on. And then from there, we always recommend kind of a high level overview of the protocol in layman's terms. So how many study visits? We break it down. Inclusion, exclusion criteria. We try to then nuance discussion around, is this what you look like? Is this how you presented or your child presented? And then get into a more definitive discussion. Maybe it's a 3-part kind of series over a couple of weeks, a discussion around the actual protocol. And we've seen sponsors change their protocol based on those discussions. We've seen it firsthand.
And Ms. Laurie, I know you've been with the company, and whenever our trial design was being implemented by clinical development, what's your thoughts about that? Because being on the industry side, like I am, knowing that we did listen to some of the, the advocates, and patients in certain circumstances about endpoints. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything, in that we absolutely do bring the patient to the table and we should listen. You know, the one thing I do just want to say is that sometimes, and we do listen to what the patients are bringing to us, but we also, I just want people to understand that within industry, there are certain guidelines that have to be followed. And within clinical trials, there are certain guidelines that have to be followed. And there are certain outcomes that the FDA requires in order to get a new treatment approved. So while there are some recommendations that patient groups may make that can absolutely be changed. And you're right, Lauren, and we have had experiences similar where things have been updated based on feedback from the patient community. But there are also things, I don't want to mislead people, because there are some things that are outside of our control that we have to do in order to get a new treatment approved. So, I just want to say absolutely 100%, we need to have the patient voice in there right from the very beginning, with the caveat that there are going to be limitations. And so we do want to make sure we manage expectations, that we're not making promises that we are unable to deliver because of FDA specific guidelines that we must follow in order to get a new treatment approved.
That is very, very true. And as we wait on other questions to come in, Ms. Lauren, I want to pose this question to you. It's a very simple one. What does good look like from you being from the advocacy organization's point of view? What does good look like whenever it comes with collaboration with researchers? What are the things to do and things not to do from your point of view?
I'm always flattered, I think, when they reach out to us, researchers, and looking to us as sort of a representative for the community, and starting with the discussion around their project, their goal, and understanding that. And then we try to match the engagement form with their project. So we've done focus groups. I think setting up advisory boards is really smart to, again, that diverse, representing different ages and places and races. Advisory boards where over time there's this back and forth relationship that's built between the research team or the study team or industry sponsor and the advisory board. And what that does is not only allows patients to be part of the research process, which I think is invaluable, but it also just, it arms them with a whole new awareness of what it takes, what's the regulatory process like, how long it actually takes. And I think, again, I go back to this, don't forget the power of peer-to-peer influence that happens out there in the rare disease community, because those patients, an ad board of 12 patients who's intimately involved with a particular study or research project is sharing with others their experience. And 99% of the time, I can tell you it's positive. They feel empowered and really just more activated and inclined to understand their disease and get others sort of more involved.
And Ms. Lauren, to that point, I know Ms. Laurie holds at least one advisory board with multiple patient advocacy groups that come together. And, I've had the privilege to attend a couple of those, and it's quite fascinating. These groups, they all have a common alignment because this is in relationship to, severe epilepsy syndromes in children and adults. But, but they all have different, things going on. Obviously, the number one thing is to have the patient improve and this, that, and the other. But how they come together and mesh as well. They learn from one another in these advisory boards, and they implement best practices. And to me, it's that sharing within advocacy that is so very unique. Laurie, do you have a comment to that?
No, just to say I agree 100%, and I'm actually currently working on a collaboration with 10 different organizations on a project together. So I can't say enough about how important that collaboration is where you can, with a caveat too that, each disease, even though they're all rare disease, all rare epilepsies, they each have their own different characteristics and nuances. So we can't really lump everybody together, but we can learn from each other, and where we can support and share, we definitely do. So very important.
Lauren and Laurie, this comes in from Rena, and it's more of a comment for patient groups. But Lauren, you indicated that physicians are busy making sure every patient is taken care of. That being said, patient groups should also consider non-physician investigators who can work with physicians to answer some of their research-related questions. Her comment is, many a times lab-based researchers are involved developing protocols and registries, but from the point of these non-physician groups, what are your thoughts about that?
So I think it's a great opportunity to look at some of the partners working in these institutions, nurses, study coordinators. There are people who are connected to the physician scientists who can really be that bridge between the work going on, I think, in the lab and the patient community, and updating them, as well as other patients. I think maybe it is using one person to sort of socialize some of the progress happening and providing updates that would be meaningful then to the community.
To both of you, this comes in from Brian. Where do young investigators go to seek seed grants or proof of concepts outside of industry? The patient organization I represent are always seeking new sites or meetings. We have over 150,000 this year and always want to develop young investigators. Are there locations or meetings that can potentially post these opportunities? Ms. Lauren, do you have a thought to that, looking at how some of these other organizations might get that seed money to start out to help out some of these investigators?
I can just speak from NEFCARE as a patient advocacy group that does actually have a grants program, obviously focused on our specific diseases. But, I wonder about some of the advocacy groups in your arena, and then possibly piggybacking on if this is a rare disease associated with one particular specialty, really going to some of those larger organizations. For us, I would say the National Kidney Foundation is an example. That is not hyper-focused on our rare diseases, but has grant offerings and opportunities.
Awesome. And Laurie, knowing that we work with a number of advocacy organizations in the epilepsy space, they also have grants for young investigators too, don't they?
They do, and for many of them, their primary focus, as Lauren mentioned with her group, is on research and obviously trying to find a cure. And so, yes, absolutely. There are many organizations, and if you don't find it within a disease specific, look to one of the umbrella orgs who might have programs. Yeah.
And this question comes from Katie, and this is more of one of those political questions, but it does happen. And the question is, we are talking about starting a foundation or organization. What do you do when you try this, but there's another foundation that attempts to shut you down or block your attempts of creating this foundation? So I sometimes I think it's interesting, the politics that happens in advocacy. Lauren, being that you're on that side of the world, do you have any advice for Katie whenever she runs into roadblocks where there may be another organization that's trying to impede their development of an organization?
I think my suggestion would organize yourself around a mission that's unique and sets you apart, as compared to this other organization or organizations. And then really, I think it helps to have influencers. With rare disease, there's a couple of KOLs out there or real pioneers that tend to have really prominent visibility. And I think it's talking and collaborating and working with some of them, because that can make a huge difference in kind of getting support, garnering support for what you're doing.
Thank you, Ms. Lauren. And I have to say that this hour has flown by. Unfortunately, we're going to have to close the question and answers. But in closing, I would really like to thank you, Lauren. And I have to say, it's been an absolute pleasure working with you over the last week. Your dedication to your community is so resounding. And I personally believe that we will remain close after this week. And then, of course, to my partner in crime from the Mutt and Jeff show, thank you, Miss Laurie, as always, for the last 5 years. You are one of my best collaborators that I've ever worked with in the industry, and both of your presentations were wonderful, and your insights to the question and the answers were also wonderful. But before you all head out to your next session, please take a few moments to respond to the polls that are being launched right now. We all appreciate your feedback on the session and want to ensure we are able to provide great content and programming for the rare community. You can also share your feedback via events@globalgenes.org. The next session will begin at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. In the meantime, we encourage you to visit the poster hall and chat with authors who are live during this hour. Additionally, we encourage you to check out the agenda for the remainder of the event, including office hours at 3:30 Eastern Time and the Cure Accelerator. Live pitch event is also at 4:30 Eastern, and be sure to take some time to explore the events page, to visit the posters, and build your itinerary for the remainder of the week. So guys, Laurie, Lauren, and to our audience, thank you so very much for attending today.
Thank you.